This video provides an overview for Chapter 12, Application, in the textbook Introduction to Biblical Interpretation. To begin with, the writers focus on the importance of application. In a nutshell, only as we act on what God says to us through His Word will that message transform and raise us to the life that He intends for us. Next, we focus on mistakes that we can make in the process of application. The first two are fairly close together. They deal with context. In short, we want to pay attention and be responsible so that the application that we offer is well rooted in the context of the passage, not simply isolating, taking out of context, or proof texting a given passage. The third mistake we want to avoid is called insufficiently analogous situations. Study carefully what the writers analyze regarding how Satan used Scripture, but used it irresponsibly in his attempt to steer Jesus off course. After taking care to avoid those mistakes in application, we want to move forward and embrace a responsible methodology for legitimate application. It starts with a step that shouldn't surprise us, and that is we need to determine what sort of application would have been appropriate for the original audience. On page 611, the first full paragraph lists a variety of applications that we want to keep in mind. So you see about 4 lines down, they inquire, is there a command to obey? That's probably what we typically think of as an application. Does the passage tell me to do something, or did it tell the original audience, in this case, to do something? But notice, in addition to that, is there an example to follow? Or perhaps the passage depicts a mistake that someone made, in which case it'll be an example to avoid. Is there a promise to claim? Is there a warning to heed? A teaching to act on? And that would be analogous to a command to obey, but instead of it being an outright imperative, we're inferring it, an imperative from a teaching. Is there a truth to believe? And then in the next sentence, does the passage we're studying surface a need that would push us to prayer, or a blessing that would push us to praise? It's important to keep in mind this range of applications as we move into this phase of exegesis. Continuing with this 4-step methodology then, the second step is to evaluate the level of specificity of the original applications. So we've surfaced an application that seems to have been directed to the original audience. The question that follows then is, does that application apply or pertain to us today? And that's what they mean by the level of specificity. What we're looking to determine is whether this is a timeless command, or is there some principle which we can extrapolate from the original audience application and then bring it to our time frame and reposition it to apply and assist us. On page 613, second paragraph, I just commend to you the discussion there about culture-bound versus timeless principles. Now the authors outline 10 steps that will help us determine whether the application for the original audience has bearing on a modern audience. To begin with, they ask, after we've isolated the principle within the target text that we're studying, are we able to find that same principle reinforced in some other book of the Bible? If so, this would reinforce the importance of the principle we've found in our target text. Next, before importing the principle from the target text into our modern audience, we should look at the same book of the Bible within which it's located and ask, do other parts of that book have any effect, or do they impinge on this particular step of application, either confining it, limiting it, or perhaps making it more expansive, broadening it? Step 3 is somewhat like step 1 in that it invites us to raise our periscope, as it were, and look to other parts of Scripture, other books of the Bible. So they ask, does this application, which we've identified in our target text, does it experience any change, amelioration, or relaxing based on other parts of Scripture? Primarily, they're thinking about Old Testament commands, some of which no longer apply under the New Covenant. Step 4 reminds us that we may encounter some fairly explicit commands given to individuals in a particular situation in the Bible, commands which God has no intent for other followers of His to embrace or enact. For example, His direction to Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. That was not a command that God hoped others of His followers would observe and follow. And if you know the story, even in the case of Abraham, God intercepted so that Abraham did not carry out that command. Step 5 is somewhat like step 4 in that it asks the question, even after we've identified an application accurately within its original context, it may be that there are cultural circumstances that made that particular command or that particular application important and needful in the original setting. But if those cultural conditions and meanings do not obtain today, then it's possible that that particular injunction would no longer be appropriate in a modern era. Step 6 is fairly close to step 5, paying attention to cultural forms which people observed in the original era, and if those forms have a different meaning today, then the application should be commensurately revised. Step 7 is an important one to focus on. Here the writers deal with developing our capacity to identify principles which will be timeless. And notice how they express it. Page 622. They ask, is the rationale for the application, that is an application we've isolated in a target passage, is it rooted in one of these 3 things? Creation ordinance, the character of God, or rooted in part of His redemptive plan for humanity? Creation ordinance is the application that we deduce in the original environment, one that is anchored in something timeless, how God intended our relationship with Him and with each other to operate from the origin of time. Or secondly, is this application something that's rooted in or springs out of the very unchanging character of God? Or is it indigenous to God's plan to rescue humanity? If the application that we isolate in the target text links into one of these 3, the creation ordinance, the order that God set up at creation before the fall, or in the very character of God, or rooted in or connected closely to his premier scheme for rescuing humanity, if the application links into one of those 3, then there's a very high likelihood that we have tapped into a timeless principle which will definitely have application in the modern era as well. In step number 8, the writers encourage us to explore whether a given application put the original audience at a distinct variance with the surrounding secular culture? If so, then this application for the original audience was prescribing what we might call a Christian culture, that is to say, living differently than the Jewish or Roman or Greek culture around them. The writers cite 3 examples. First, attitude towards women's roles. On page 623, the bottom paragraph, middle of the bottom paragraph, they write, a few partial parallels, for example, to husbands, love your wives in Ephesians. A few partial parallels one may find in the ancient world, but none enjoins as sacrificial an abandonment of men's own rights and privileges as Paul's statement, which goes on to add, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy. So they are saying, since the behavior for husbands that is prescribed is at such variance with the secular culture, that tips us off to the fact that this must be a timeless principle, which God is wanting to characterize a Christian culture, as we might call it, the behavior of those following him. The second example involving Christian culture at variance with standard secular cultural norms involves homosexual conduct. Because Paul's cautions in Romans 1 against homosexual conduct and against heterosexual misconduct as well were at such variance with the Greco-Roman culture, then we may infer that these were intended not to be limited just to that original audience, but rather are timeless principles for our benefit. In step number 9, the authors encourage us to consider carefully whether or not there may be a condition that limits a given promise or prophecy. Consider, for example, God's promise to answer prayer. The writers point out that there is an implicit condition, that is, prayers that are according to God's will, he will then answer. As far as prophecies with a condition, they take up the large topic of promises for Israel yet unfulfilled. This topic moves into the discussion of to what degree are followers of Christ, that is the church, are they the recipients of those prophecies and promises? Over against, to what degree do some of those promises and prophecies still pertain to the ethnic Israelites? Good people differ on this, but as you read this portion, you'll be navigating question number 9. Does the passage contain an explicit or implicit condition that limits, or we might say specifies, or redefines its application? The 10th and final question that the authors raise to help us determine the level of specificity or applicability of the original applications is this: should we adopt a so-called redemptive movement hermeneutic that suggests we move beyond New Testament teaching? Underlying this question is the realization that over time God has revealed his plan and will with increasing clarity. As a result, we today understand more of God's master game plan than did Abraham, or Adam, or David, or Jeremiah. We call this expanding disclosure progressive revelation. Related to progressive revelation, certain behavioral standards or expectations for God's people have shifted over time. Consider Jewish ceremonial law. Followers of God no longer need to observe Jewish ceremonial laws subsequent to Jesus' new covenant. This is part of the trajectory God intended all along. Or consider the practice of slavery. Certain rules in the Old Testament reformed how owners could treat slaves, making life more humane for them. This trend or trajectory accelerates in the New Testament, which encourages slaves to take advantage of opportunities for freedom. By extrapolating this trajectory, we see abolition of slavery as a logical, progressive extension of scriptural intent. What about homosexual conduct? Is there evidence in Scripture that God was progressively relaxing earlier boundaries on sexual behavior, mapping a trajectory which may approve gay and lesbian behavior today? Some today would say that although homosexual conduct is prohibited in Scripture, God intended his followers eventually to realize that was not his permanent intent. The authors of our textbook point out, however, that both testaments clearly caution against the harm of such conduct, with no suggestion that it was a time-limited directive. Here is a truth that must be expressed in love for each individual, not in condemnation. What about the role of women in the church? Here the writers allow that many New Testament references portray women in what they refer to as quote-unquote unprecedented leadership roles. These suggest that the New Testament envisions women assuming more responsibility than would have been customary in the Old Testament. A final comment on this point number 10 is that we should notice the writer's caution against prejudicing above Scripture evidence that may arise from science or social sciences, for science can be updated and social scientific positions may be reversed in time.